stepped into New York in the winter of 1780. The city you know is gone. The harbor is no longer water, but a sheet of ice stretching as far as the eye can see. Horses pull carts across the frozen Hudson. Soldiers march over the river as if it were a road. And ordinary people, wrapped in rags and wool, walk where ships once sailed. The winter of 1780 wasn't just cold, it was catastrophic. A season that turned one of the busiest colonial ports into a frozen wasteland, trapping ships, starving families, and testing the endurance of everyone who dared to survive. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you're fascinated by New York's hidden history like I am, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps us uncover more of these amazing tales from the city's past.
New York in 1780 was still a young city, barely recognizable compared to the metropolis we know today. Roughly 30,000 souls lived crammed between its wooden houses, narrow cobblestone streets, and crowded taverns that reeked of ale and unwashed bodies. The skyline was low, no towering buildings, just church steeples and the occasional three-story merchant house piercing the winter sky. The American Revolution was in full swing, and the city had been under British occupation since 1776. Red-coated soldiers patrolled the streets, their breath visible in the increasingly frigid air. Supplies were already desperately scarce. Food prices had skyrocketed beyond what most families could afford. Political tension simmered like a pot ready to boil over. And then came the cold. This wasn't just any winter. It struck during the height of what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period spanning roughly from the 14th to the 19th century, when the Northern Hemisphere experienced relentlessly harsh winters, shortened growing seasons, and unpredictable, devastating storms. Rivers that had never frozen solid became highways of ice. Crops failed across Europe and America. But even among those notoriously harsh decades, the winter of 1780 stood out as something truly extraordinary.
November had been unusually mild, lulling New Yorkers into a false sense of security. Then, December's winds arrived like an invading army, cutting deeper and sharper than anyone could remember. The temperature plummeted so suddenly that people caught outdoors found their clothing frozen to their skin within minutes. By January, the harbor was choked with ice floes, grinding against each other with sounds like thunder. Ships that had been preparing to leave port found themselves trapped, their hulls groaning under the pressure of expanding ice. By February, the truly unimaginable happened. The East River and the Hudson froze completely solid. Not just along the banks where ice typically formed, but all the way across, from Manhattan to Brooklyn, from New Jersey clear across to Staten Island. Picture this for a moment. Imagine standing on the Battery, the southern tip of Manhattan, and looking out toward the harbor. Instead of seeing ships rocking gently at anchor, their masts swaying with the current, you'd witness something that defied belief. A frozen desert, silent and white, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The only sounds would be the occasional crack of shifting ice and the howl of wind across the barren surface. Children, those resilient enough to venture outside, played games where seagulls had once circled merchant vessels. Brave merchants dragged heavy wooden sleds across the ice to deliver barrels of precious supplies to Staten Island and beyond. British soldiers, adapting to this new reality, used the frozen rivers as highways of war, marching their regiments across what had once been impassable waterways.
For ordinary New Yorkers, the blacksmiths, seamstresses, dock workers, and tavern keepers, survival became a daily, desperate struggle against an enemy they couldn't fight. the cold itself. Firewood became more valuable than gold. Families systematically tore apart wooden fences, ripped doors from their hinges, and even broke up furniture piece by piece to feed the flames that meant the difference between life and death. The city's few remaining trees were stripped bare, their branches disappearing into hungry fireplaces across Manhattan. Food supplies dwindled to nothing. The few markets still operating had almost nothing to sell, and what little they offered cost more than most families earned in a month. Salted fish and rock-hard bread became luxuries that only the wealthy could afford. In the poorest neighborhoods, cats, rats, and even dogs began disappearing from the alleys, eaten by families facing starvation. Water froze solid in buckets inside homes, despite fires burning constantly. Families slept huddled together for warmth, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, layering coats over dresses over shirts until they could barely move. Wealthy merchants wrapped themselves in imported furs, while the poor stuffed newspaper and rags into their clothes, creating makeshift insulation against the killing cold. At night, the city fell into an eerie, unnatural silence. No carriages clattered across cobblestones. The horses were too weak, the roads too treacherous with ice. No ships creaked at the docks because there were no ships, only frozen hulks trapped in solid water. The only sounds that broke the silence were the periodic groans of ice shifting in the harbor, echoing through the darkness like distant cannon fire, reminding everyone that nature had taken control.
New York in 1780 was a city caught in the crossfire of revolution. Occupied by the British since their victory at the Battle of Long Island, blockaded by American forces controlling the surrounding countryside, it was already a pressure cooker of military tension. The winter of 1780 didn't just add another layer of difficulty, it fundamentally changed how both sides approached the war. The Hudson River, now solid as a stone road, allowed soldiers to cross without boats, barges, or any of the complex logistics that water crossings typically required. Armies could move heavy cannon, supply wagons, and entire regiments directly across what had been New York's primary natural defense. Nature had literally rewritten the strategic map of the war. British troops, taking advantage of this unexpected opportunity, marched confidently across the ice to establish patrol positions that had once been protected by open water. They could now reinforce Staten Island without worrying about rebel naval attacks. American rebels, watching from the mainland, began planning audacious raids across the frozen harbor that would have been impossible just months before. Meanwhile, the civilian population, already struggling under martial law, food shortages, and the constant presence of occupying troops, now faced the additional burden of a winter that seemed determined to kill them all. Contemporary accounts from 1780 describe it as a winter beyond all memory, a season so severe that seasoned colonists who had lived through decades of harsh northeastern winters declared they had never seen anything like it. Local newspapers, when they could still print on paper that hadn't frozen solid, wrote of a season so severe that the very seas seemed dead. Personal diaries and letters that survived tell horrifying tales. Birds found frozen mid-flight, dropping from the sky like stones. Cattle in the surrounding countryside collapsing dead in fields, their bodies preserved like statues until spring. People discovered lifeless in alleys and doorways, their skin blue-black with frostbite, their final expressions frozen in time. The harbor remained locked in ice for weeks that stretched into months, even when the sun finally began to show some strength in late February and early March. The thaw was agonizingly slow. As the ice finally began to crack and melt, the city was overwhelmed by a stench that residents would remember for years. The smell of rotting supplies that had been preserved in the cold, and worse, the bodies of both humans and animals that emerged from beneath the snow as it melted.
Why does the winter of 1780 matter to us today, more than 2 centuries later? Because it reveals something profound about New York's character and resilience, and shows us just how fragile even the greatest cities can be when faced with nature's full fury. Today, New York seems eternal, invincible, a concrete and steel giant that has weathered everything history could throw at it. But in 1780, a single winter nearly broke the city completely. The ice transformed water into land, comfort into hardship, and a proud colonial port into a place of desperation where survival was never guaranteed. The winter also left a psychological scar on the city's collective memory that lasted for generations. Older residents would tell stories of 1780 for decades afterward, using it as the measuring stick for every subsequent harsh winter. "It's cold," they would say, "but not 1780 cold." Even during the fierce storms of the 19th and 20th centuries, winters that brought their own challenges and hardships, the Hudson River never again froze with quite the same devastating completeness. This winter also demonstrated something remarkable about human resilience. Despite facing conditions that seemed designed to break them, New Yorkers found ways to adapt, survive, and even help each other. Neighbors shared firewood, families took in strangers, communities came together in ways that the normal commerce and competition of city life rarely allowed.
Step back one final time into that frozen world of 1780. Close your eyes and picture the absolute silence of the harbor on a moonlit night, broken only by the crunch of boots on ice as a night watchman makes his rounds. See the thin streams of smoke rising from chimneys, burning the very last scraps of wood anyone could find. Feel the bite of air so cold it makes your lungs ache just to breathe. For New Yorkers in 1780, winter wasn't just a season to endure. It was an enemy as ruthless as any army, as unforgiving as the most brutal general. It reminded everyone living in that fragile port town, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest laborer, that despite all their plans and ambitions, nature would always have the final word. The winter of 1780 in New York wasn't just brutal. It wasn't just historic. It was legendary. A season that tested the very soul of a city and proved that even in the face of impossible odds, New Yorkers would find a way to survive, adapt, and ultimately thrive. That's the incredible true story of the winter that froze New York solid. What other forgotten chapters of the city's history would you like to see us explore? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Good Old New York for more amazing stories from the city that never sleeps, even when it's buried under ice.